Welcome to Creative Distillation, where we distill entrepreneurship research into actionable insights. My name's Jeff York, Professor of Entrepreneurship at the Leeds School of Business and Research Director at the Deming Center for Entrepreneurship. I'm joined, as always, by my co-host,
Brad Werner. I am the Teaching Director at the Deming Center for Entrepreneurship at the Leeds School. I am an instructor of entrepreneurship, but Jeff, you know me, I'm an entrepreneur.
I do indeed. One of the most interesting entrepreneurs I've met, which is why I love doing this show with Brad. I've probably told this story many times, but one time I had Brad be the guest judge for like 2 different classes back to back. And it was pretty hilarious because we had people doing private air transportation to Aspen for large companies, running restaurants, designing skis. I believe there was a CBD brownie involved, not in the class, but it was one of the pitches. There were many things pitched, and all the students were like, Brad's like, oh yeah, I was involved in a private airplane business. Oh yeah, I used to own a restaurant. Oh yeah, I started a nonprofit bakery. And they're just like, who the hell? Anyway, so Brad, you're done with classes. We are sitting here the day that grades are due at the Leeds School of Business at the University of Colorado. I turned mine in right before I came here, so this will be a celebratory podcast for me.
Yeah, and I have about 3 hours left to go, so the wine will be helpful.
Well, I'm sure your students will be reassured by that. The leniency of the grading will advance as Brad's afternoon goes on. So lucky for the students. Well, so we are excited again, as has been our tradition during, actually, we should mention, so one thing that's different this week, for the first time since, when was it? February 2020, I guess. So over a year, Brad and I are in the same room doing the podcast. We're actually in Brad's kitchen. This is really exciting for us. We're both, of course, fully vaccinated, and it's just, I don't know, man. It's kind of almost emotional, like to be sitting here with you doing this.
I totally agree. I mean, you know what? You kind of get used to lockdown, but it's nice. Actually, I shook Jeff's hand when he walked in the door, and I haven't shaken anybody's hand. I can't even remember the last time I did it. So
I immediately got my hand sanitizer after that.
Yeah.
But I would have done that before COVID if I shook Brad's hand. Oh, I'll be here all week, folks. No, it's really, really nice to be sitting here with you, Brad. Brad's made us a lovely coffee in preparation for our beverage of the day, which is not coffee because, we only do that when the dean's on the podcast. She's still mad about that. Like, by the way, Brad, she's like, why you guys are always like drinking cool stuff? And you had me on and we go to a coffee place. What's up with that? Like, you're the dean. She's like, screw that.
We could change that.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, anyway, we'll definitely take Sharon out to wherever she wants to go. So we are really excited. We were getting ready to do today's subject with the two of us and with Joel, because Joel, our producer, has some really interesting experience in this realm. And then we were like, man, we should go get the authors of this paper because this paper is really interesting. I was sort of browsing through the journals like I do, looking for interesting papers. And I knew one of the authors' work, and I was like always interested in what he writes about. I didn't know the other 2 authors, but man, this is an interesting paper. And again, so we've talked a little bit about Administrative Science Quarterly. I'm sure you don't remember, Brad.
Okay, I have to stop you right there. There's no way that we can dive into papers without talking about wine and having a little bit of wine first, and then maybe we can sit back.
Of course. No, Brad, we're getting straight to business this week.
I can't handle it.
Straight to business, man. Talking about papers. We're going to talk about the ontological assumptions underlying the theory in this paper in depth. Anyway, okay, so Brad's cut me off. But I will introduce our guests. So we have 2 guests this week. First, Deborah Brown. Deborah is a doctor at the Department of Politics and International Studies at the University of Cambridge. Welcome, Deborah.
Deborah?
Much. It's great to be here.
Wonderful to see you. Thanks for joining us. And then our second guest is Shaz Ansari. Shaz is a professor at the Judge Business School at the University of Cambridge. Thanks for joining us, Shaz.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. Great to see you, everyone.
It's great to see you. Shaz and I are sort of seeing, we were supposed to see each other when I was visiting Cambridge, but then he had to travel. And I think somebody told me they might have just been promising this on your behalf without you knowing, Shaz, but apparently you were going to try to get me to a high dinner or the high table at your house. Is that true? You probably knew nothing about this. They were just promising on your behalf.
No, I would have been glad to. I would have been more than happy.
But that is a thing, right? I mean, that's an actual real thing.
Okay, fill us in here. Let's back up. What does this mean?
Okay, that's why I'm going to ask Shaz to explain because I didn't get to go, so I don't really.
Deborah has been to many as well. I mean, it's just that we do these formal dinners at colleges where students and faculty members and fellows get together. So it's colleges in Cambridge represent departments from all over the place. So they could be physics, law, business school, whereas the department, I only meet the business school types. But at the college, you can meet a physicist, an oncologist, a person who studies divinity. So you can kind of meet all kinds of people at the college. And these dinners represent, so you could be sitting next to someone who's discussing philosophy and divinity and not just business models. So it's kind of interesting to meet all kinds of people at these college dinners, which represent a wide spectrum.
I would also say it's quite different from what you might expect at a typical dinner at a university in the US. So all students to academics wear gowns, and based on what sort of qualification you have, you wear a different gown. You start with grace in Latin, end in Latin, a very specific manner of toast, and it's called the high table because you're sitting literally up high with the master. So an elevated table as well.
Wow, I'm kind of going back to Harry Potter movies.
Yeah, this is what every American says when this is described to them, I think.
Pretty much.
Or anybody, I guess, now, anybody in the world. Someday we'll get back and have to do that. We has signed up to co-host the ongoing International Entrepreneurship Innovation Conference, which Cambridge is one of the sponsoring entities, along with the Darden School. And unfortunately, because of the pandemic, of course, that's been delayed. But someday we're going to come over there when you guys host this, and we're just going to interview everyone. And really, Brad, have you ever been to Cambridge?
I have, actually.
Yeah, it's a beautiful city.
Great.
Just a great city. So, but Deborah, you selected our beverage for today. This is really interesting because we've now you are not English, though. You are American. Is that correct, Deborah?
Yeah. Well, German father, American Texan mother, and born in England, but grew up in the US.
Right.
Nice.
And so does your pick have any significance to your lineage or anything like that? Or did that's just what you prefer to drink?
Like Californian wines. And I thought,
there we go. All right.
To the West Coast, you guys kind of being in the US on the at least the west side of the country, even if not exactly on the West Coast.
Interestingly, your pick was a little tricky to find. I had to go to 3 different wine shops here in Boulder, which was a real hardship for me. It was a real challenge. I had to go to these places, and I bought a lot of beer too while I was there. But why don't you tell us about your selection? Because I think it's safe to say Brad has one of the most extensive whiskey collections of anyone I've ever known. I have a lot of beer at my house. So between us, we got those things covered. But I don't think either of us know really much of anything about wine other than we like it. So why don't you tell us about this? Why did you choose this? Well, first of all, what is it and why did you choose it?
Well, so it is Au Bon Climat, which is a Californian Pinot Noir. And I chose it because, quite frankly, I like to drink it. So I'm probably in the same camp as you guys when it comes to wine. I just like it a lot, frankly.
That works for me.
No French wines pretty well, and particularly kind of Southern French wines, but thought it would be nice to choose something that was American. Thought I had a really good source of Au Bon Climat in Cambridge. And actually, prior to my academic years, I spent 5 years living in Moscow. And for whatever reason, Au Bon Climat was one of the wines that I could reliably find much of the time. And so it just kind of became a bit of a safety blanket. So I just think it's a really lovely, easy drinking red wine.
We just poured ours, and I'm a real nerd, so I'm gonna be smelling the wine and stuff.
Yep.
Cheers! Right, cheers! Wow,
see you, man.
Oh, that is nice too. Let's do another cheers.
One more.
Right in the mic. First real cheers.
Brad, I love whiskey too, by the way, Brad. So Brad can tell you, are you a single malt fan or just any fan of?
I love trying all of them. I think that they have such personalities that it's just fun for me.
I can't consume the same amount as whiskeys, but still.
Well, it's interesting, actually. So the story behind the wine, too, is when I was working in Russia, one of my biggest clients was the National Diamond Company. And they would spend a lot of time in Yakutia and Siberia. And so all the miners would drink quite a lot of vodka. So as a defense mechanism, they became like experts in wine. And so gathered a bit of knowledge from them, but certainly find it easier to drink half a bottle of red wine than half a bottle of vodka.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Oh, God.
Wow.
It might be easier to drink half a bottle of vodka. It's just much worse results in my experience. Especially if you're hanging out with Russians. Like, oh, my goodness. Like,
maybe next podcast I can watch you do that.
Probably not. But maybe. You never know. Oh, man. So, all right. I got super floral aroma on this wine to me. I think this might be one of the more expensive bottles of wine ever bought, which is kind of embarrassing because it's not an expensive wine. I go into wine. I mean, I've bought way more expensive bottles of beer than this wine. So I go in the wine store and I'm like, okay, I need some wine. What's rated over 90 by Wine Spectator? And I don't really care much about it, so I'll buy whatever's cheapest. And that's kind of my wine selection process. Embarrassing. I should be more cultured, But this, the wines I usually buy are very approachable, very jammy is the descriptor I look for, Things that, typically people at a party would go like, oh, this is nice. It's got bold flavors. But this has a really, almost like I'm getting like a floral, almost like a rose aroma. Does anybody else pick up on that? Or is that just me being really nerdy?
I think there's a bit of like a vanilla to it as well.
Yeah.
And maybe just a bit of like a warm, like baking spices.
I think we're going to get Jeff off of the Boxo wine. I think he's moving up in the world.
There we go.
This is really good, Deborah.
And actually this one, which I had never had before, which is the Isabella Bon Climat, like I said, is this special version of it, which is really delicious if you have a chance to try it as well. But I found it.
This is delicious and hopefully available at your local liquor store more than mine.
Which liquor store did you find that at, by the way?
What's the one by Whole Foods?
That sounds about right.
Oh, it's a Whole Foods Liquors, I think.
Is it Whole Foods Liquor?
Yeah.
I don't know. I was there at 8 this morning. It's really interesting who's at the liquor store at 8 in the morning.
Did they know your name, by the way?
No, they don't. There was a guy. There was a person sleeping outside the liquor store. They did not look like they were experiencing homelessness or anything. It was just a pretty well-dressed person sleeping on the door to the liquor store. I don't know what was going on with them. They didn't wake up when I went in, so it was very interesting. And then there was a lady that walked into the liquor store and sort of just stood there as though she was going to ask somebody a question, but she never did. She just stood there for a while and then she turned around and left. It was really interesting. 8 in the morning. It's very interesting. So if you go to the Whole Foods liquor store in Boulder, excellent liquor store, had this wine no one else did. I actually went to our other standbys, North Boulder Liquor. Remember, support North Boulder Liquor. Yeah. It's the liquor store of choice, the Deming Center for Entrepreneurship at the Leeds School of Business. Excellent establishment. Or Hazel's, which is another actually really great liquor store here in Boulder. And that's enough advertising for Boulder liquor stores. Thank you for the pick, though, Deborah. This is lovely.
I think it's a great pick also.
I really like it.
For us in Colorado, I think it's 1 o'clock. What time is it with you guys? Is it 7 or 8 in the evening, 30, right?
Yeah. 8:30 in the evening.
Yeah, so I think we have a little different vibe going on here.
Yeah, that's why we're having coffee with ours. This is better than when we did the non-alcoholic beer with the British person. That was
well, the one thing we've learned about the podcast, Jeff, is never to do it completely sober.
Yeah, well, we learn these lessons.
Well, when I was a teenager, I lived in Chile, and the studying trick was, again, this is in deep Patagonia, to have red wine and Coca-Cola. Calimocho.
Really?
Yeah, red wine and Coca-Cola. I have not had it, to be fair, maybe in close to 30 years.
Would they mix it?
Yeah, that was a mix. That was kind of like, instead of rum and Coke, red wine and Coca-Cola. Like I said.
Like the guy that was putting Macallan in his coffee.
Oh, yeah, that was we don't even need to go back there.
He spent like 20-year Macallan in like his coffee. That was like, I thought Brad was going to have a heart attack. It was great. My favorite part of every podcast ever.
Yeah, that kid's not with the university anymore.
Yes, he is. He's doing very well. He's going to be he's a great scholar.
Yeah, but I have something about his judgment I'm concerned about.
Brad, has the cannabis stores heard the liquor stores?
I actually don't think that they have. I would love to look at the data on that. They're both very crowded.
Perfect.
I think the guy that was asleep in front of the liquor store perhaps went to the cannabis store on his way to the liquor store.
Yeah, and by the way, the cannabis stores don't open until 10, and the liquor stores.
I know.
Yeah, so maybe that's.
I've noticed that. It's really hard to get in there before 10 when I'm trying to get down to the cannabis store in the morning on my way to teach. So anyway,
all right. We love the wine. I think this is good. I think
we love the wine. I think I've got a warm glow in my chest now from it to complement the buzz from the coffee. So that's great. So we are ready to talk about the paper then. From Patanjali to the Gospel of Sweat, yoga's remarkable transformation from a sacred movement into a thriving global market.
Let's just stop there.
Go ahead.
Okay. That's the title, correct?
Yeah. Now, don't tell me. So we first dissect the title. We usually spend half the podcast on the title with Brad. So you guys have to bear with us.
Well, it's like going to a bookstore for me, right? I look at titles first. So one more time with that title, please, because I don't know what Patanjali is.
Well, I know. That's why it's intriguing. From Patanjali to the Gospel of Sweat, yoga's remarkable transformation from a sacred movement into a thriving global market.
Okay. Will someone help me out with the first word, though? Patanjali.
Absolutely. So Patanjali is he's an Indian sage, or possibly a collection of people that existed kind of 100 to 300 CE. And he came up with this sort of ur-text of yoga that is widely cited and has been institutionalized by kind of yoga certification, yoga training, as like, this is the text that is a foundation of yoga. But he dedicates in his 108 sutras sort of one line basically to asana, which is a physical practice, which is a steady, calm seat. And it is revered as sort of this text to give you the 8-limb path that is meant to bring you to liberation. So a very small part of it is about physical posture, and the vast majority is about achieving this divine state of meditation.
So one night, Deborah, after a couple bottles of Pinot Noir, were you thinking, this is my next research project? How does this happen?
I have to be honest, it was a little bit slightly more maybe pragmatic and maybe even a little bit selfish than that, which is that I had done my master's at Cambridge on microfinance and the commercialization of microfinance. Microfinance kind of being at the time, and I think perhaps still in some circles, like a panacea for everything, of alleviation of poverty, of making profits, of this kind of great world. I had designed this incredible PhD research project, which involved quite a lot of time in Mexico and India, and then sort of looked around and realized that with one child under 1, so 11 months old, and a 2-year-old daughter, that perhaps it wasn't the best research design. So I went in to meet Kamal Munir, the lead author on the paper, who very kindly agreed to take me on as a PhD student on the basis of working on microfinance, because he'd been doing some research in the area, and said, Kamal, I'm struggling. I know that literally my course starts tomorrow, but I'm wondering if I couldn't do something where I could spend some more time in the UK and have a better research design. And there's something I'm really passionate about, which is yoga. And Kamal kind of looked at me and he said, yoga? It's kind of like cupcakes. It was nowhere and now it's everywhere.
Oh,
Interesting.
Yeah. Okay.
And so then is your second call, Shaz? How did you two get together then?
We need a couple of supervisors on the committee. So then Kamal and I are colleagues. We teach together. We are the same business school. So we formed that PhD committee, which then became part of the committee for Deborah.
This is from your dissertation research then, Deborah.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Wow. Congratulations. Because for folks that are listening to this that don't know, getting your dissertation research into Administrative Science Corollary, or ASQ, is quite an achievement. That is really outstanding. And not to mention, like, if you ever wanted to pick up an academic paper from this podcast, I won't say this. There's no slight on any of the other papers we've ever talked about, and just read it because you think, like, I want to read an academic paper. This is a good one to start with because it's very approachable. It's really interesting. And as you just hear from Deborah's explanation, like, very steeped in an understanding of the history of yoga as a movement and then finally as a market. And I think that's what I found really fascinating about the paper.
And I think that we can think of relationships of other movements. I think is where this is going and how the movement, entrepreneurship, and change happens. Absolutely.
Well, so tell us a little bit about the paper. Just sort of give us the high level overview of like how you did this research and what you learned.
And in words, Deborah, that I can understand.
I'm pretty good at that. So going back to the title of the paper, and not to spend half the podcast discussing it, but the next part of that, so you go obviously from this Indian sage, is the Gospel of Sweat. And the Gospel of Sweat was an event that Lululemon, the very ubiquitous yoga apparel wear company, put on at a church in New York City. And literally it had mock Bibles in the pews emblazoned with the Lululemon logo. It had inspirational speakers. So it was how you could go from something that was a profoundly sacred text into an event that was very much a corporate marketing event that still called on a lot of the imagery and on this idea of the sacred, but for very commercial purposes, yoga becoming obviously a multi-billion-dollar market. So the paper itself, really what we're exploring, and it was very much grounded research, so we didn't go into it with a preconceived notion of what was coming out the other side, was just to understand how could you go, again, from sacred texts like Patanjali into this multi-billion-dollar market. And what makes it particularly interesting is that the sage who spread really the gospel of Patanjali in the West and is seen by many yoga scholars as kind of being the first one to bring the concept of yoga to the West, Vivekananda, he would talk about how yoga is antithetical to the West. So you have your consumerist culture, but what we're bringing you is something better. We're bringing you meditation, something superior. And obviously that's just been turned on its head. So really what we explore in the paper is how you could take a movement and turn it into a market and go into these issues of kind of what that is required of that. Because of course, there can be positives to a market. You can have better access, it spreads the word, you have all the resources, but then also the levels of decontextualization, of corruption that come alongside it. Maybe let Shaz talk a little bit more too about.
I need to interrupt for a second because I'm having a little bit of a tough time. So I'm thinking about yoga and kind of the high level values that you were referring to, and then I'm thinking about Lululemon, a company that used child labor to keep low costs for their products. So how does that work?
Well, not to mention putting Ayn Rand quotes on their bags at one point.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first two steps of this 8-limb path that Patanjali outlines, the yamas and the niyamas, are ways that you're meant to lead your life. So cleanliness, abstinence, truth, non-stealing. And so they take this concept and they say, we're going to put inspirational quotes on their shopping bags that, for a long time were very coveted. But, they're ridiculous, they drink lots of water and be nice to your friends. And they're just completely vacuous and basically kind of saying nothing but making people probably feel kind of good about themselves.
Yeah, this is like Google, don't be evil.
Don't be evil, exactly.
Well, there's an 8-year-old embroidering these into their clothing somewhere in India.
Yeah, and even like Chip Wilson, the guy that founded Lululemon, he's been quoted directly as talking about how at one point he stopped employing yogis in his stores and he started employing runners because they were kind of more type A and on the ball in the early days.
He even passed a sexist comment for which he got chided. Remember, Deborah? He made some comment about the kind of women and the bodies that are suitable for...
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah,
I remember that. So that was also...
Yeah.
Well, I mean, am I mistaken? They were putting like Ayn Rand objectivist philosophical quotes about like self-actualization. And I mean, for those who are not familiar with objectivism, it's basically the idea that acting only in your self-interest will lead to great outcomes for everybody. I think that's a fair summation of the philosophy, quote unquote philosophy.
A really interesting point you pick up on too, because what we talk about in the paper too is how, yoga went from in many ways a collectivist and kind of working,
Right.
Of course you undertake yourself, but still you're all working towards this kind of greater good and this samadhi, and you're observing these kind of moral standards into this really individual cultural of individualization, and sort of it's your own responsibility and you can be the best you can be. And I think it's something that is incredibly prevalent in yoga classes today across the board, that there's a lot of talk of like, making yourself out to be the best. And again, this self-actualization rather than talking about kind of greater society.
Yeah. Seems like we're talking about Nike there. This is interesting. I'm just thinking about that clash of values, though. To me, is very, very interesting. Obviously, Lululemon has moved on as a company. They're not like that now. But that early combining, the meeting of the minds, to me, had to be just. I actually don't understand it.
Well, that's what this paper eliminates, right? I mean, that's what's so cool about what these authors have achieved, in my opinion. They're charting the path from how does something go from a collectivist, anti-capitalist, almost loss of self is like the highest aspiration. I mean, I practiced yoga, but I know nothing. But how does it go from that to being a market, like literally a market? And I think what's fascinating is you guys, the way you frame the paper is you start off talking about the research on moral markets. So things like organic foods and grass-fed beef and, green building and renewable energy, all of these markets that we're awash in here in Boulder, and I'm sure you are in Cambridge as well, that have this moral dimension, and they have become capitalist markets, but those things are all infused with the very simple ideology of like, the more we sell, the more benefit we have. The more renewable energy I sell, the less carbon emissions go into the air. So it's very easy. It's not hard for people to say like, okay, that's fine. I can get on board with that. But yoga, I mean, I learned a lot from reading the paper, starts off as this anti-capitalist, anti-marketing, and gets morphed over time. And then they actually chart the path through which that happens, right? They explain the thing you're not understanding.
I love it. So was there a tipping point somewhere that it received critical mass? I guess I'd love to hear you talk me through it a little more.
One thing I would mention is that, which is an important part of the paper, is that two things. What the reviewers help us do is not to cast markets as something evil.
Yes.
So we have started talking about Lululemon, which is the sort of downside of what's happened,
Sure.
but not anything about yoga becoming mass scale or commodified. Not everything about it is bad or evil. So I'll clarify that for a second to saying that it's not all bad. Second thing, yes, because it was so far removed from a market, you needed some insider complicity or some insider support at the beginning. So yoga, which was one of the sort of the key, let's say, gatekeeper of how yoga was being diffused, and especially in the West, they wanted some advertisements just to survive, just to scale the movement, to get subscribers. Like any movement, they would have liked more people to do yoga. They would like more people to join the journal. In doing so, they started accepting corporate ads. And when they accepted those corporate ads, gradually that sort of was paving the way. And what the yoga editor says, the genie was out of the bottle. So she says, and we quote her in the paper, that once they allowed this to happen, then it was a gradual infiltration, if you like, or the entry of entrepreneurs and others who then found ways of combining that with their own interests and taking yoga in a different direction. So it was something that the insiders had to sort of initiate before entrepreneurs or anybody else would become interested.
Were they selective, Shaz, in the types of corporate ads that they would allow? I mean, was there some sort of vetting process?
Yes, there was contestation. So the more Puritan readers were initially complaining not to allow this ads. There was contestation within the subscribers, and the editors were sort of probably more enthusiastic and more lax in accepting ads just to increase revenue, increase subscribership, whereas the more hardcore followers were criticizing this, were opposing this, but eventually they got kind of sort of silenced out in a sense in this as it began to show the value of having these generate revenue, keep the journal alive, increase subscribership. So they talk about resistance. And I think you're raising an important point. Why wasn't there any stronger resistance? There was, but because it wasn't opposing any specific thing. It wasn't like anti-X or anti-Y. Those voices got drowned out. It wasn't like, antagonizing anyone, so to speak.
Right. It wasn't like they were promoting tobacco and someone could get behind that and say, we're not doing this.
Right.
It was more general and diffuse than that.
Yeah, for example, health people became interested. Oh, it can solve your back pain. Okay, great. It can solve back pain. Now, why not allow the whole holistic medicine field to be part of this yoga thing? Because if it solves back pain, then why waste this? Why not use this? Why not let all the people with back pain benefit from yoga? So that kind of thinking then got the holistic medicine merging onto yoga. That thing got, it makes you fit. It can even develop muscles later on. And the fitness movement got into the yoga thing. And Deborah can add to that how these different discourses kind of got added on to yoga slowly.
I think between really the 1970s and the 1990s, the interactions and the intersections between the New Age movement, so the spirituality that was very largely individualistic, the holistic health movement, again, we're looking at alternative health routes. So yoga became something that was almost like prescribed or something that people would do in order to stretch and feel a bit better and used for health reasons. And then also the fitness movement. And I mean, I think if you were to point to one of the three to be the largest kind of tipping point in favor of the market, it would have been fitness, because there isn't a controversy between a fitness movement necessarily and the market. So it's a lot easier to kind of commoditize an exercise class or a certification scheme. So there's certification schemes for personal trainers in other realms of fitness. So it became something that was kind of more broadly accepted.
This is fascinating. Can you cite an example of another movement that maybe took this approach and it didn't work?
You're going to ask a tough question, Brad. Let me take the easier way out of movements that have worked, especially anti-market movements. So think about mindfulness. And that's become corporatized, Salin and everywhere, where corporations offer mindfulness programs. So mindfulness has nothing to do with this corporatization of mindfulness, but it also became a market, if you like, with trainers, certified instructors. So it's very similar to yoga in some ways. You could argue the Chinese practice of Tai Chi is still kind of limited. You see some people doing their little motions in the morning.
Oh, yeah.
So I would argue, I'm not sure if someone has made I talked to a couple of Chinese, and that some people have been trying to popularize it and diffuse it and make it bigger than it is. It hasn't quite scaled. It's near what yoga is or mindfulness is.
Let me rephrase the question. What about movements that are currently out there that would benefit from this happening in their space? This is what happens when I have a couple glasses of wine, guys.
I've actually got something. If it give you guys a chance to think, I got an idea on that.
Yeah, no, it's good. It's one example actually that we looked at, Shaz, early on was the Occupy movement. So obviously Occupy, that was very counter-capitalist. And then you started to see within like Occupy tent camps, there would be people springing up selling like T-shirts or Save the Honeybees, and all of these different organizations would sort of latch on to Occupy. And there were all these different intersections. So it became a movement that was first kind of purely anti-capitalist and then sort of expanded into a wider camp. But I wouldn't say it's become a market.
Right.
No.
Right.
Deborah, that's a great example, but maybe Black Lives Matter. I mean, we do mention in that paper. So Black Lives Matter is not a market, but there are people who leverage Black fashion, Black Lives Matter T-shirts.
Absolutely.
I think there is some commoditization already in that. And some people would say it helps spread the word. It makes it more known. Parts of the world where BLM is people don't know what BLM is. Maybe wearing a BLM t-shirt is not so bad because it spreads the word. On the other hand, the wife of David Beckham, Victoria Beckham, who runs a fashion boutique, she was criticized for charging quite a hefty profit on Black Lives Matter t-shirts. And she was saying, well, this was meant to be for a cause, not for you to profit from it. So she sold quite a lot of t-shirts during this peak of the movement with BLM from her range. So you could argue there's a little bit of that commodification of BLM, but there's nowhere 50 billion market, but potentially you could think of, it could.
Absolutely.
That's really interesting.
So I think you could see very parallel. There's a great paper. It's by Sean Hyatt, Brandon Lee. Oh gosh, who else was the author on that one?
Lonsbury?
Yeah, Lonsbury. That's right. Yeah, about the organic foods movement. Really nice paper about how that morphed over time. And seeing them present that work and then reading that paper, what I've noticed is agriculture is having a really hard time moving from organic to regenerative. And organic's sort of an easy sale because you can say to a parent, hey, this doesn't have pesticides on it. Do you want to feed your kids pesticides or yourself pesticides? Or you want to pay a little extra for this organic food? Are you an evil bastard, or are you someone who's going to part with a little more money for this food? It's an easy sale, right? Anybody who's a parent's like, yeah, I'll buy the organic food. Anybody who's health conscious, like, well, I'll buy that. The problem is, like, organic food helps some with our problems of agriculture, but not nearly enough. We can't get to like a no-till agriculture. We don't really sequester any carbon through that. It's a problem. Regenerative agriculture does do all that. It could be a huge part of solving climate change. However, there's no self-interest angle on regenerative agriculture. It's not like, hey, this is because this was done with regenerative agriculture. There's no health benefit sale. There's no flavor sale. It's very tough. Magali Delmas has written a lot about this, about the marketing of green products, particularly. Like, you got to figure out what's the self-interest angle. And I think that's a lot of what happens in the study here. I love how it moves from this idea of transcending the self for the sake of a sacred goal, almost a religious attainment of spiritualization, to, hey, here's how you get really toned abs and look super fit and be cool. And I think your point's very well taken, Shaz. It's not such a bad thing, right? Because yoga does have huge benefits. I mean, I practiced yoga in the wake of breaking my neck, and it helped me a ton. And I still, to this day, really enjoy going to yoga classes. I am not a spiritualist, but I really enjoy it. And I probably never would have known about it had this movement not occurred. But I do think it's something we have to think about. Like, for entrepreneurs, what does this tell entrepreneurs? Like, I think you got to get to the what's in it for me to really market things effectively to people. At least that's what I took from some of the paper. I don't know if you guys would agree with that or not.
Deborah, maybe you can bring in Tara's styles and how she said it's for everyone, right?
Her whole concept is like kind of who made the rules. So this concept that, she thought that yoga could be too orthodox in New York City. So she wanted to kind of create her own reality and kind of have an extremely unorthodox style of yoga. And in fact, in my bookshelf downstairs, her Slim, Calm, Sexy yoga book is there. And I realized I had to remove it because when I was teaching on Zoom, I don't know, maybe it was my imagination, but the students were staring at it. But she kind of had this attempt to kind of reinvent it. And it is interesting when you talk about organic foods is I think yoga, and the reason we saw it as like an identity movement is people will really can consider themselves as like, I am a yogi, and kind of a halo effect, which can be really interesting I think as an entrepreneur, in my own humble experience and perspective, it's a question of if you're taking something and you're taking a movement and you are turning it into a market, or you're trying to profit off it, which there's nothing wrong with profit. If you're selectively desacralizing things or decontextualizing things, at what point does that become uncomfortable? Like, at what point do you say, right, I'm going to teach yoga, but I'm not going to put 50 pictures of Ganesh and Buddha around the studio if I'm not going to explain who they are and what they represent. So like when I went to the Lululemon store opening in London, the yoga teacher, so they did a free class. She said, we're going to do a little chant to Ganesha, and he's just this cute little harmless guy. He looks like an elephant. I've never seen him before. And actually, is it okay? I mean, I'm not the moral judge of the universe, but it's kind of deciding how you want to be true to something. So if you're going to use what could be considered sacred imagery, whether it is something like looking at Black Lives Matter or something that has a religious, that you consider what sort of level of respect you'll actually pay to that if you're going to invoke it in selling whatever you're selling.
And I also think it's interesting, the tangential businesses that have arisen around yoga. And this is, I think, where I could like to pull Joel into the conversation. Joel, why don't you kind of speak a little bit to your experience in the yoga music business?
Well, let me just preface it by saying that by far, like 98% of the people that I encountered in my 20 years working in the yoga biz and the yoga music biz, and just sort of the alternative spirituality and health and healing sector to begin with, most of those people, their heart was in the right place. They had very good intentions and they really were trying to walk the walk. But ultimately, for me, I sort of stumbled into that biz. Long story, but wound up in the yoga music business. And for me, I found myself to be sort of the secular guy at the spiritual conference kind of thing. Like, I really appreciated the sense of community and positivity and really like people wanting to support each other and build a better life and a better world. But I couldn't, when it got into like the more kirtan mantra, Om Namah Shivaya kind of stuff, I couldn't really go there. And ultimately I just found that and this was more from like seeing it from the music sector and from the artist's point of view as a representative artist, just seeing how even though there's it's an $80 billion or $50 billion, a huge $1 billion industry, most of the artists had to sell tickets to the festival, and the money they made off selling the tickets was their fee for playing the festival, which would be, the festival was happening twice a year, attended by thousands of people. There was definitely money being made there. And for the artists to have to pay their own way to this festival, I thought was ridiculous. And then there was the whole, worked with some Indian artists who felt like they were being shut out in favor of these more Western white artists to play the music that they were brought up playing. So there was an authenticity thing there and a sincerity thing that I was just having trouble with. And ultimately, I would go to these festivals and work our music tent and sell music and meet a lot of the people attending these festivals, and they were beautiful people and it was really lovely. But I don't know, I started to feel like I was working at the mall.
You bring up a good point, and I'd love to hear our guest's opinion on this about that authenticity component. Because I would say through entrepreneurship, that's really, really a critical piece of this. Deborah, where do you chime in and kind of how the yoga industry has evolved with that kind of core piece of authenticity?
That's something I find really challenging because even just the word authenticity in and of itself is really loaded. So what is authentic to me versus what might be an ancient practice? And I think obviously there is going to be some level of evolution, a huge level of evolution. But clearly it is really difficult. You see people, and I would totally concur with Joel, the vast majority of people I've encountered and met, and I was a yoga teacher and that I've taught, their heart's in the right place. It's a great community, but there is an authenticity question when there isn't a holistic appreciation of what the practice is, more than just a sign that's maybe in the bathrooms of a yoga studio.
Yeah, really interesting.
I mean, wouldn't you say that there's a perception? I mean, imagine if you and I are protesting at a Black Lives Matter movement, or we make a joke, does that cost a different thing as compared to a person of African origin? And just the perceptions of that in terms of how people perceive, right? Even the support for some cause, given African student of mine makes all kinds of jokes, black jokes. If you and I made those jokes, we'd probably be kicked out and, ostracized. So even those make a difference of where you're coming from and how people perceive.
And I actually think that there are outsiders that come into these and look for ways to manipulate that and just only are thinking of dollar signs. And we can think of lots of movements where you see people that show up that that their true motive is not the movement, but how do they personally benefit?
Yeah, in my humble opinion, there's also a huge difference. I completely agree, Brad. There's a difference between the cultural appropriation and cultural appreciation. Yep. So if you're appropriating a culture by stealing an image of Ganesh and using Om in a class and overcharging your students and, for example, admitting students onto yoga teacher training programs that are vastly overcharged and for students, quite frankly, that aren't ready to become teachers, then maybe there is a level of appropriation because you're trying to teach a guru lineage practice and you're doing it in a way that, again, maybe this question of authenticity comes up versus appreciation, which is agreeing very much with what Joel has had to say, that the vast majority of people in the yoga world, their heart is in the right place and they have a real love for India, for yoga. There's been a huge amount of fundraising in the yoga community for India recently around COVID. So, and I think that is very much genuine. So it's how you can harness that good intention and marry it into the market that is really the crux of the challenge.
And I think that some of these people that come in that we were just referring to actually could set those movements back. I think it's dangerous for a movement to have kind of those people intrude into the movement as well, when there's just only self-interest at the core of their motivation.
But is that really true, though? I mean, because like I think what I love about this paper is that that's sort of the interpretation we can land on pretty quickly.
Yep.
To say, okay, these, and obviously this is a podcast about entrepreneurship. We're at the Deming Center for Entrepreneurship.
Hey.
And we like to believe there's a danger of the heroic entrepreneur story. All entrepreneurs are like great people and they're awesome. And, we all know that's not true because,
it's not,
because we live in the world and we pay attention. However, there's the other story that, entrepreneurs are all evil bastards trying to exploit everyone for their own sake. They don't really care about creating value for others. And I think that's a narrative that happens all too easily. And what I love about this paper is the complexity of the theorizing that's going on here. The idea that look, many entrepreneurs do utilize movements to create markets. And I think that's we're always like, what's the actionable insight? Hey, entrepreneurs out there, if you're looking for an idea, go look at what's happening in society. What movements are happening? What norms are changing? This is why I try to teach in a lot of my classes when we talk about green building and renewable energy and things like this, understand how people's belief systems and values are shifting and try to tap into that. But also that these movements need markets. Not all movements, of course, need to have markets, but a market can really accelerate and instantiate a movement in a way that nothing else can in some instances. And they might need this. I'd argue this is a case where the success of yoga, and for every person that's in that yoga class that cares about getting toned abs, there's probably a few people that actually dig a little deeper as well, I would suspect. And I think this has propagated the movement of the spiritual aspects of yoga as well. I don't know if that's true, but
I think you summed it up beautifully. And I guess my next question then is, was this accidental, this collision of these two things, or was this intentional?
It's hard to always pin down intentionality in any process. I think it was emergent, so to speak. So, okay, here am I'm going to create a market out of this, and Tara Stiles was ready, and all these people were ready to exploit it or something. It was more of a evolutionary process. These corporate ads came in. I mean, it's happened to other movements. I mean, there's a great book it's called The Sellout, which is on the gay movement. And the whole description is how advertising became usually a huge part of the LGBT industry. And the whole discourse shifted from gay rights to gay products. So think about that shift. It wasn't that it was done with a purpose. Okay, there's LGBT community. How do I exploit it? And how do I market these products to the LGBT community and the wider community now? Or versus an emergent process where this was an idea that caught on and then became diffused. So I think it's more emergent. And one thing that Jeff was referring to, it's not movements versus markets, it's movements and markets.
Right.
I was referring to microfinance. So the idea was poverty reduction, and then it had to be called financial inclusion. And once you redefine poverty reduction as financial inclusion, it widened up a much wider set of people who could be part of it. Just like organic food, Jeff, you were mentioning that paper, and I had a long discussion with Sean Hyatt, who was visiting a judge 3 years ago. And when he mentioned organic food, you had to change the definition from it being producer-centric to product-centric. A product is much easier much wider and scalable than certifying a producer. I mean, you can get 10 producers, but you can certify millions of products. So that definition had to change for scaling up. Sometimes it's difficult to sort of scale up things and remain too Puritan. And in my opinion, yoga, not everyone can be a hardcore yogi who spends 30 years meditating and achieving a high level of spirituality and becoming the next achieving nirvana or whatever. For a lot of people, it fixes everyday issues. So there's no for everyone to say, hey, this is authentic yoga, limited to these 1,000 people who can do this. Why not thousands of others, as Jeff, you benefit from it? And people have their own ways of benefiting from it. So if it appeals to more people in a wide variety of ways, yes, it may not be doing justice to the core set of values or the authentic beginnings, as Joel was referring to, and people could complain it got appropriated. But on the other hand, I mean, who has the right to keep a culture preserved and, and circumscribed, or any practice for that?
Yeah, really interesting.
I think one actor too that we really should be mentioning when we talk about the emergent nature of like yoga and how it developed into a market would be Bikram Choudhury, the disgraced now hot yoga guru, because when he first came to LA, he wasn't charging a huge amount of money and he was teaching on his own and he became popular in his own right. And then he was sort of encouraged, like, well, you need to charge more money for your classes. And then he patented it and he copyrighted his sequences and he started his extremely, $8,000 teacher training that would have hundreds of teacher trainees in it, franchises of studios across the world. So it was also, I think, some of it was the collision of cultures. He would say, and he had said in an interview, it was the American way. So like he takes his yoga and he packages it and he sells it. So it was this kind of commodification of trying to have a system that you could then sell.
Really, really interesting. My takeaway here is that for entrepreneurs, stick to your values, right? Develop a values framework on how you make decisions and stay with that. And I think that would be really helpful.
We talked about the fluid nature of authenticity, how it's always in the eyes of whatever audience is making the judgment. But I think if you do what Brad's prescribing and you're working with like trying to take a movement and create a market out of it or take some piece of a movement, I think if you can align the values of your business with that movement's values, then you can actually help the people. I mean, most people don't do this just out of the blue. They're aligned and interested in the movement in the first place, like Deborah was. And so I think if you can do that, then you can tap into that sense of authenticity amongst many audiences that'll matter and grow your market at the same time.
And I would also add to that, though, I think that the friction comes during scaling, right?
Yeah,
and that's the problem. So you need to stick to your values as you scale, right? The early traction should be, I think it seems like it's organic. But beyond that, really hold true to those. And I think you'll do all of your stakeholders well.
Right. That's very interesting. Coming back to your question of where have been the challenges, I think of Messy Church, which is a very interesting movement, the Messy Church. Messy Church?
Messy Church.
Messy Church. It's a whole movement. There are papers written about it, academic papers written about this. It's trying to popularize the church experience because church attendances have been falling. So how do you popularize attendance and come to the church? And Messy Church is a movement to not commodify, but to scale, to popularize, to make it interesting. I mean, a lot of in London have been converted to restaurants and cafes because of lack of attendance. My college in Cambridge, St. Edmund's College, is a Catholic college. And obviously there was my executive MBA student who's a priest. And they're worried about this commercialization and churches turning to cafes. So can you stop this? Can you make this attendance beyond Sundays? Can you make people come here, a bit more people come here? Maybe not in the authentic, original way, because maybe that's not appealing to the current setup of people, given their lifestyles, time pressures, etc. Maybe you need to reframe it so they have children's playgrounds in there, more shows. Just like Airbnb had to reinvent itself for COVID, you would have to say churches need to think in innovative ways to boost attendance. Which doesn't mean they need to shed all their core values, but they need to still reinvent, reframe, resignify, and package that in a way which has appeal. I mean, I would say that, right?
Well, and I'd like to compare that to some of the mega churches in the United States that now own TV stations and have arenas filled with people. I mean, it really is amazing. This is a whole nother podcast, and I do not want to walk down this lane. So I am smart enough to stop right there.
Well, if we could just get Jim and Tammy Faye Baker back, everything will be okay. So anyway, so the name of the paper. From Patanjali to the Gospel of Sweat, Yoga's Remarkable Transformation from a Sacred Movement into a Thriving Global Market by Kamal Manur, Shaz Ansari. I'm always that pronounced Kamal's
Shaz
name wrong. All right, thank you, Shaz. I appreciate it. And Deborah Brown. It has been just a pleasure having some wine with you this afternoon and talking about this paper. Just a great paper, and congratulations to you both on it. It's really, I think it's going to be enormously influential. It really is taking the study of moral markets in a further direction, expanding that, which I think is critically important as we think about, what do business schools do and what do us as entrepreneurship teachers do hopefully we teach our students how to take on something a little more meaningful than ROI and spread it and create broader value for society. And the last thing I'll say is you guys have totally inspired me to revisit a project I have on the shelf, which is tracking this exact same process in skateboarding and how it moved from a punk rock, anti-capitalist, total, FU sport, quote unquote, into being in the Olympics whenever we can have an Olympics again. I think that's a really meaningful story to me as someone who grew up on skate ramps. And you've re-inspired me to go back to that. And anyway, PhD students could do far worse than reading this paper for inspiration. Nice job to both of you. Kudos.
Yeah, and I'd just like to say thank you. I really enjoyed the conversation, the afternoon, the wine. And when Jeff and I are able to make it to Cambridge, we're going to take you up on a couple of pub crawls or something. I think we'd have a great time. So thank you very much.
Pub crawls and high tables.
I love it. If that's the name of your next paper, Deborah, I'll read the whole thing.
I love that. Pub crawls and high tables. That's a great name.
I always underestimate how much fun can one have on Zoom. I always underestimate it. But when you, of course, we would like to have a real in-person drink, but I always underestimate that you can have so much fun if you just sort of get into it and connect and it's fantastic.
Well, that means a lot to us, Shaz. Thanks.
Yeah.
I'm glad you had a good time. And we certainly look forward to raising a glass to you in person. So that's it for Creative Distillation for this, whatever period we're releasing them in, weekly, bi-weekly, I don't know. But once again, I'm Jeff York, Associate Professor of Entrepreneurship at the Deming Center for Entrepreneurship at the Leeds School of Business. As always, joined by...
I'm Brad Werner, work at the Deming Center for Entrepreneurship. It was great seeing all of you. Thank you very much. I hope to really see you in person. I had a blast today.
Brad, one more cheers to us being together in person.
Sir.
It's so nice to be here.
Yep.
Cheers. Cheers, everyone.
Cheers, man.